Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. This is my part 12, the Umayyads, history therein. I hope you enjoy. Where did we leave off? Totally different incident, yeah, that's it. But it probably reflects a brutal attempt by Abdullah Rashid, aided by the Marwars Amaris B. Yusuf, to impose Umayyad rule on Toledo. If it was unsuccessful. For hard evidence of Umayyad control in Toledo, we have to wait until the reign of Abdullah Rashid II, 822 to 52. In the 830s, the people of Toledo seem to have been causing disturbances by trying to assert their authority over the surrounding countryside, and the Emir was obliged to fortify Calavaria to protect Corrado and the Golvera Valley from these raids in 831 and 2. Calavaria lay near the old high road from Toledo to Corrado, and this strategic site was... my apologies. This strategic site was, in the 12th century, to become the Epimorus final occupation by Umayyad troops. As at Merida, the citadel was fortified and governors, usually Umayyads, appointed, but it is unclear how far Umayyad authority extended beyond the city walls. The upper march, based on the Eberos Valley, was in the capital of Zagreb, presents a more complicated picture. There was more urban settlements beside the capital. Toldon, Hoskris and Calatid and Toronto were all towns of some substance. Muslim controlled the plains to the north of the Eberos, but Muslim settlements ended at a 1,000-metre contour line. The valley and mountains to the north remained in the hands of the indigenous Christian inhabitants. There were a more complicated ethnic mix, as well as some Bebians and very powerful Malwan families. These was a sizable Arab population, or at least people who claimed Arab descent, especially in Zagreb itself. To add to this, relations with the Christians, notable the rulers of Nevers, and for a period the Carolingians, was much more complicated. Like his father, Al-Hakim I attempted to extend his influence in the area, not by direct military action, but by alliances with their leading Malwan emirs. B. Yusuf of Hasim and Al-Hakim invited him to keep the people of Toledo in check. He was obviously a powerful figure. After this, he was transferred to Zagreb and then to Toledo to restrain the powers of other Malwid families. The Banquezo in 802, he died in 812, still an ally of the Umayyads, and his family remained influential in their native Huskar. It is interesting to note that the power of local converts, like Amirs and the Amaris and the Emirs, reliance on him rather than on any of the local Arab families. The Banu Qasir returned their power and their quasi-autonomous status. By the end of the 8th century, they appeared in the Arab sources as the leading magnates of the Upper Ebron, and it is clear that they had close relations with the Christian kings of Pampeluna, with whom family they intermarried, and who many may have provided them with Basque soldiers for their armies. Despite Amiris' occupation of Toledon, they retained their power. At first, their relations with the Abdullah-Rishids was friendly, but after a quarrel at the Saifa in 842, Musa B. Fatima B. Qasim, then leader of the family, defied the Umayyads, allied himself to the king of Nevers instead. In 844, he was able to do Abdul al-Rashid a good turn with the Vikings attacking Seville, and he sent troops to help. By the end of the reign, he had re-established his power. The Christian chronicles of Alfrende III said that he himself called the third king of Spain, the other two being the king of Oviedo and the emir of Córdoba, because this is basically one of the more powerful families on Spain that wasn't realistically a king, though. He was able to use his local power base and pivot positions on the frontier to ensure that the emir could not replace him or rule the area without his cooperation. The city of Zagreb itself was conquered by Abdullah Rashid in person in 844 and entrusted to his son Muhammad. It remained under Umayyad rule until the emir's death in 852. So far, the last 8 years of his reign, all three capitals of the Threigrid... disgusting laughs... yawns at the moment. I do apologise. Where were we? Raised the three capitals of Thurgrin, Merida, Tolerus and Zagreb were under the direct control of Córdoba and ruled by supporters of the Umayyads sent from the capital. They did not mean, however, that they were undisputed rulers of all of Andalusia. That rule may not have extended far beyond the walls of the capitals, and as events immediately after Al-Andalus were to show, separatist forces were still very much alive in the area. Now, this is only, again, the Christian chronicles, which I don't absolutely agree with, because there was a certain level of autonomy where each of the towns and villages have been noted of recording and looking out for help from the Muslim majority cities, where they would call out and ask for assistance. The assistance was granted because the Christians were paying jizya tax, so the Muslims had an obligation to protect them and their right to their churches from other raiders, because there were Viking raiders at the time as well. The only area of the Muslims' world which showed parallel development at this time is Khorasan in northeast Iran, which local Iranian princes converted to Islam and acknowledged the caliph's overall authority, but were in fact independent rulers of their own areas, who could and did defy the government if they felt their interests were threatened. A further illustration of the devolution and nature of power in the area can be seen from the account preserved in the survival sections of Ibn Husseyn's history of Al-Abshin's reign. According to this, a certain Ubayd Ali B. Yahya, governor of Taurus, wrote to Abdul al-Rashid in 850 and 851 to say that he did not need any troops from the central government, but would make do with 130 military page recruits from his own Malwi. The emir replied that he was satisfied with the arrangement and agreed that they should be paid from the government revenue. The governor was allowed to keep the cash collected from the poll tax, tithes and other dues in the area to ransom prisoners and keep the difference in good order. He was also given 200 dinars a month on this revenue for his own salary, with an annual bonus of 1,000 dinars. This showed the governor enjoyed a large measure of physical autonomy. He could pay his own troops from the taxes collected in the area, and there no suggestion that any money was paid to Cordoba. It is unlikely that Abdul al-Rashid was surrendering any real power with this agreement, and more probably that he was simply regulating an existing situation. Now, remember, these northern territories, as far as Cordoba was extremely difficult to govern. They were a mixed people. They weren't just Arabs and Bedouins. They were Arab Bedouins with Christian wives, and many of them mixed Christian people. So they had a link by both sides. And this dualitable link drew them together, and it made them stronger as a people. So the idea that the Islamic world was wiping out Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula is complete and utter garbage. Anybody who can read and critique history can prove that. Intermarrying amongst the Christians was a normal thing amongst the early Arabs of the Iberian Peninsula. Where are we? Yeah, the Iberian Peninsula in the 9th century. So this is basically where my position 13 will go. But I'm not going to go beyond all of that. The history of the Iberian Peninsula is extremely complex and always has been. It was a mixture of what worked as local powers. There were Christian vassals of the Muslim rulers. There were Muslim vassals of Christian rulers. But people don't tend to like this type of mixation that went on, that the main powers jockeyed backwards and forwards. The Carolingian Empire actually had theoretical power down here, but they didn't actually apply it as well as they should do. It was more as a boost, more of a morality, if that makes sense. Lastly, there was a great deal of insurrectional behaviour amongst many of the Christian bishops. And the funny thing about Islam is it was allowed. The bishops rebelled and spread false hope, but to maintain the balance of power, to maintain the emirs and the sultans of Iberia allowed the Christian clerics to do this because it kept the Christian autonomy and thereby kept the larger Christian armies from the Franken lands and the Dane lands and England itself from coming down and crusading on them. See, there was always the question of what should we do with the Muslims in Spain. As an ex-Christian myself, this is how we were told it in historic lessons. But the question was never truly revealed or maintained because the autonomy of the bishops. This autonomy is probably one of the reasons that the longevity of the Iberian Peninsula's Muslim rule also happened. Because you'll remember at this point, they weren't fighting and they weren't jihadingly defending themselves. The Al-Andalus was a separate Sultanate Islamic country. They were probably the first of the Islamic countries that was independent of the caliphates themselves. I think the 5th or 6th caliphate. I think it might have been the 7th. I'm not entirely sure. We're not talking the first 4 here. We're talking number 5, I think, was the Umayyads. The Umayyads then broke down. And then I'm not sure if it was the Abyssinians who took over next. I'm not entirely sure on which caliph takes over. But the next caliph took over. They fled, went over to Spain. And this is where they started building their first real independent power. Like the first actual proper modern, from their time period, Muslim country, instead of a converted one that owed allegiance to the caliph. Alhamdulillah. But yeah, that's my critiquing. That's part, I'll see you next time, part 13.